the money point, because when you're talking about those defenses, the knee-jerk, the reflexive action is, what blinking box should I buy in order to become more secure? And I need to communicate better in order to get more money, in order to get another blinking box that will then make me feel safer and allow me to sleep better at night. At the most base level, let's go with one data point from the Ponemon Institute in a survey we conducted, that 90% of organizations bought something that was discontinued prior to being alive and active, or was retired shortly thereafter. I mean, if we ignore everything else, that is clearly waste in the system. But let's move beyond that and think about all of the no and low cost options for security that can be added if you think through the steps of the cyber kill chain. So let's take delivery, right? You receive an email, it is a phishing attempt, it is dangerous. You can think about this as the human firewall, right? We all receive God knows how many emails in a given day, and we need to stop that moment. How do you stop delivery? What we do is we tag all external mail at the email gateway with all caps, external, colon, and then whatever subject that sender initially put in as subject. So whether it's from my spouse, whether it's from a soccer club, a child's school, it says external. I treat that email in a fundamentally different way. I know that there's an inherent risk to that email that doesn't exist, on internal mail, and I need to treat that differently. How much does it cost to add external at the gateway? Second example, when you talk through the cyber kill chain, is the notion of command and control. Okay, an infected machine is communicating back with a keyboard in another country. How do you stop that? You want to break the ability to have an automated beaconing back. So what do? You look at web traffic, and web traffic is categorized. Is it a financial institution? Is it a retail institution? Is it an entertainment institution? A bulk of web traffic is called uncategorized. It's too new to be understood by common vendor categorization. People don't know what it is. It's not well leveraged. If you block uncategorized, if you require a human to take out an RSA token or have two-factor authentication to say, yes, I do in fact want to go to this uncategorized website. And there are a lot of good reasons for uncategorized website. To take my child's preschool. It's uncategorized, not enough people hit it in a day, it's not Wells Fargo. But I have to intentionally take out a token and type into that, rather than have an automated beaconing back to it. That is a low-cost solution, and I think that comes by internalizing this notion of, let me get a defense against each step in this chain, rather than just say, this is a new security tool, I need it. In closing, it's difficult to say who has the advantage. Okay, this symmetry or the asymmetry of attackers versus defenders, we'll know that over time when defenders step up and use the advantages that are implicit and available today. And I don't think we've reached that point as an economy, as a government, as enterprises, as government departments and agencies. So what I encourage is we think through the steps of the cyber kill chain, we think through of migrating to a version of intelligence-driven defense, and then we can move to that dialogue of the basic symmetries in cyberspace. So some basic thoughts to get us going today. Thank you very much for your time.
Questions from the audience? Any questions? Right here?
Sure.
Just wait 1 second, we'll get you a mic. Yep. For all those viewers at home.
One quick question. With the Security Intelligence Center that you were talking about, and I don't disagree with what you've said up to this point, but it still does not get you ahead of the attacker. You're still in the reactive mode. Doesn't mean you don't have advantages, but you're still reacting. Is there any way to get ahead?
There is, and a great, wonderful question, thank you. So the reaction occurs, if you look at the cyber kill chain from the standpoint of something's been delivered. At that moment in time, I'm reacting, and I completely agree. Let's think about two ways to be proactive. One is there are steps preceding that. There's a step of reconnaissance, right? I'm an attacker, I'm interested in your network, and I'm going to seek to understand that network. And this could be as simple as searching at yourcompanyname.com in Google in order to get some email addresses associated with your domain. That web traffic hits your domain. And so by understanding when Google accesses your domain, you can identify parties that are doing searches like that. And that's one way to be days, weeks, or months ahead of an adversary before they've even attacked, so to speak. The second way is that analytic aspect of knowledge and information management. You may be reactive to an event, but you are proactive for the next event. And so what I mean by that is there's a conversation around the 0 day, right? Everyone's talking about the 0 day and the exploit. The 0 day is a limited aspect of that cyber kill chain. In my mind, there are 7 attempts at a 0 day, and you have to change all 7 aspects. So it's not just the exploit, it's all of the other things around it. And if I stop you once and unpack all of those other attributes, then the next time you come, if I've baked that into my defenses, I'm ahead of you because I know the telltale signs that you've used before, and I can stop you when you've changed aspects of it. So, wonderful question. I greatly appreciate it.
Any other questions? Greg, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And now we're going to welcome Coordinator Painter and Sarah Sorcher, the Deputy Editor of Passcode, to continue the program. Grab it, I'll take it. Yep, I got it. Yeah, we'd like to thank our Passcode roadie, Coordinator Painter. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much for joining us. So as Marshall kicked us off, the rules of the road in cyberspace are still very much evolving, and today we will hear from the State Department, and then we will also hear from the Defense Department, key experts in the private sector and research, hear more about their perspectives. I will kick us off, but I also do want to leave time for audience questions, so we will get to that very soon. So the timing of this event is pretty good, I would say, with
the rain?
Because, well, I was more thinking the visit of the Chinese president last week. So that's made this topic about strategy in cyberspace, what is the US thinking on this front, a pretty hot topic here in Washington. So why don't we start there? Last week, the big headline out of the agreement between the US and China is that neither country would use cyber espionage to either steal or support the theft of intellectual property. So how significant in the scheme of things is this agreement?
So there are 4 parts of this agreement. I should start by saying that the president has been very clear for some time, not just the president, but my boss, Secretary Kerry, and many others, that the continued state-sponsored theft of trade secrets and intellectual property for commercial gain was something that was just unacceptable, and that no country should engage in. And really never before had we had a commitment from the Chinese government that that was something that was impermissible and shouldn't be done. So it is very significant to get that commitment. There were other parts of the agreement as well, including creating a mechanism and a commitment to share and cooperate in investigations and creating a high-level mechanism to make sure that's going forward. And also an agreement to continue to discuss and further really discuss norms of appropriate state behavior in cyberspace, some of these rules of the road, where there's already been some discussion in a number of forums I think we'll talk about a little bit later, and creating a senior group to continue to discuss that. So I think this doesn't in any way solve all of our concerns or problems with China. And of course, one of the things the president said is very much the proof will be in the pudding. We'll see,
right.
Do actions meet words, and that's important. But I do think this is significant because it really has been a major step, an important step along the way to address this concern that we have, and to make sure that where we're dealing with issues that we are concerned about in terms of escalation and other issues in cyberspace, there is an avenue to discuss that, and there's a way to follow up on investigations.
So are you optimistic that China will hold up its end of the deal?
I want to see what we actually see in the next few months. So what actions we see will tell us whether or not they want to live up to their commitments. Of course, I very much hope they do, because I do think it would be important for them to do so and for us to move forward.
And so some people are calling this agreement in some ways a carrot, but there is also the very obvious threat of a stick in the form of sanctions. There were news reports just before the visit that the US was developing a raft of sanctions targeting Chinese entities that either carried out or benefited from the theft of American trade secrets. So if the U.S. already believes that China is doing this practice, and why not just have the sanctions now?
So what the president has said is that nothing is really off the table, that we will continue to protect our businesses, our citizens from cyber intrusions and attacks, and we'll use all the tools that we have. And of course, one of the tools that was developed, an additional arrow in our quiver, if you will, was this executive order to create a sanctions regime to apply economic sanctions in cyberspace. I will not comment on when and if or how those sanctions or other tools will be used, but I'll say it was very clear. His statement was very clear that all those things still remain, that we can use those in the future if we need to.
So was this part of the negotiating strategy, in a sense, to have this threat of sanctions on the table before the president came to visit? And
again, I think we were very clear about both the concerns and that we're prepared to take action. And I'm happy to see that we got some agreement. We'll see where it goes. And
so it's just more specifically about enforcement. So if China does not hold up the agreement, and you now have this agreement in writing between the two countries, I mean, is it sanctions that's the next step? Is there another? Oh, you're right there. Would you say that is the next step, or what other steps are on the table in terms of enforcement?
I think, as we said, with any threats that we see out there, we will act, and we could use a number of tools that we have at a time and place of our choosing. So I'm not going to either prejudge or say what possible tools we could use, but I think this framework that we discussed last week does provide a mechanism to hold China and other actors accountable for their actions.
So how do the geopolitics of this play into making some decisions about how to respond to various cyber attacks? Because you have the sanctions in response to North Korea's attack on Sony, which was a destructive attack on a private company, but then you have China as the lead suspect in the OPM breach, and you have the persistent threat of intellectual property theft from China, but we're sort of in the agreement phase with them.
Well, we have a range. Again, we have a range of threats. We have both technical threats and we have policy threats. So the technical threats range from everything from things like we saw with Sony in North Korea, which was really a destructive attack. We've seen those around the world with other actors involved. We see state actors, we see criminal actors, where they're always worried about terrorists doing this, but we really haven't seen terrorists attacking infrastructure yet, but that's always a concern. So there's a range of different possibilities we have, and those possibilities range from diplomatic to trade to law enforcement to even in appropriate cases, if it's a significant enough threat, to even military. So we have to look at all those different range of options, depending on what the case is. And again, much as you'd like me to, I'm not going to say what those possible ones are going to be in a particular case, but we'll look at all of the things we have, we'll look at the attribution we have, we'll look at who the actor is, and we'll see what tools are appropriate.
And so this is actually and
it could be a combination of tools as well.
So this is actually a very complex cultural issue as well, too, because the common thinking goes that China actually sees economic espionage as part of its own national security strategy, and that culturally copying others' work is not necessarily seen as theft, but more as flattery. So, I mean, what do you see as a way to bridge these different views between China and the U.S. about what is national security and even what is just appropriate behavior online?
So this is one of the, this is in a larger context of one of the norms, and we'll talk more about the kind of political military norms that we've been advancing. But one of the norms that we've been advancing in this space is the norm that no country should either self-engage or promote the theft of intellectual property or trade secrets for commercial gain. We don't do it. We don't think any country should do it. This is one of the things that we have been pressing on the international stage. We'd like to see more countries sign up to that. And that's why one of the reasons I think last week's agreement was significant, because it, again, for the first time, was a clear statement by the Chinese side that they agreed. Now, even beyond that, I think the problem with that kind of activity is that would lead at most to short-term gains. What it does in the long term economically is it undermines a country's ability to actually innovate. And as countries move from the chain of just making things to innovating their own things, simply taking those trade secrets don't help them, because they might help them in the short term, but they don't innovate in the long term, and that hurts them economically. It's a harder argument because it's a longer term argument, but it's one I think is very important. So there's both the the issue of, look, if you do this, there are a number of kinds of costs that can be imposed, but also this is not good for you. And so this is something we're promoting not just with respect to China, but more generally.
So this is something that you are talking about with them?
We're talking about with all countries, yeah.
And so this past summer, too, the United Nations group of governmental experts did agree that there are some rules of the road in cyberspace during peacetime, including that countries should not damage each other's critical infrastructure with cyber attacks, and that they should protect computer incident response teams. So how far does this go towards developing some norms, and what areas still need the most work?
So I think it's useful, again, to look in this larger context, that when we talk about what we call the diplomatic efforts around cyber or cyber foreign policy, this is a new endeavor. I mean, literally 5 years ago, this didn't really exist. We were the first office that did this. Now there are about 25 counterparts around the world. We started this discussion on international law, and going back a little bit, the international law. You don't need a whole new legal construct, but existing international law, including things like the law of armed conflict, the UN Charter, applies to that very high level of cyber conflict. There were other countries that didn't agree with that at that point. They wanted to create a whole new system. For whatever reason. And so back in 2013, with the same group of governmental experts, we got an agreement that international law applies. Now we're still working out what that means. How does proportionality, how does distinction, how do all these things apply in cyberspace? But we realized back then, and subsequently, that we don't see cyber war very often. I mean, you could argue we haven't really seen it at all, but there have been very few instances that would qualify. And so the major amount of activity we see is below that very high threshold. And so how do you start thinking about norms or rules of the road for that activity, for the activity that falls below, the kind of activity we see all the time? And we started promoting, and again, just a couple of years ago, so it's remarkable how much progress has been in adoption of this, these ideas of what we call peacetime norms. So this is, again, as you said, no country should, absent wartime, attack another country's critical infrastructure. It's inherently destabilizing. It doesn't help anyone. It doesn't help the environment. It doesn't help the stability of the environment. No country should attack the CERT of another country. It's like going after the ambulance, as the Red Cross. No country should use their CERT for evil. They should not be using it for offensive purposes, but for defensive purposes. And if asked, a country has a duty, when malicious code's coming from that country, to cooperate either through technical means to mitigate or through law enforcement means. We think that combination really leads to greater stability in cyberspace. But that's not all the, of course, there's more work to be done here, but it was important to get this agreement among 20 countries that included China, included Russia, included the US, included the UK and Germany and many others, that these norms should apply. And that's something we want to even take broad.
So what's something that didn't get included there that that you're pushing now?
Well, I think we're now evaluating and seeing what other things do we think are important. What are some of the other normative things that we want to advance? The intellectual property one was not in that because that was not a political military norm. That's very important. I think we made significant progress with that. And then part of this is when we got the consensus back in 2013 on international law, we then took that even beyond those group of countries. So it ended up as being a statement in the G7. It ended up being a statement in the NATO ministerial. So we need to take this more and really get other countries to think about this and to adopt them.
Right. So if the U.S. and other international powers can agree on norms, and that sounds pretty great, but what about everybody else who might, isn't part of the problem in cyber that you could be dealing with a hacker or a country that has these capabilities but might not have the same incentives to fall in line?
Yeah. So I think this is, again, it's a long-term effort, even though we made substantial progress. So there's been two parts of this. The norms part, and then also trying to build better confidence between countries, confidence building measures, so you don't inadvertently escalate cyber conflict. But they're not the only actors. States are not the only actors, and of course you could have rogue states or others who would not participate. In the long term, the way I look at this, and we've talked about this before, is that as you get more and more countries to sign up to these norms, if you have countries who are outside of that group, those countries can act, those more like-minded countries can act to enforce them. And again, there's a range of ways to do that. And the example I use, although it's just a loose example, is this idea of the Proliferation Security Initiative, where countries are so concerned about the transfer of fissioned material that they banded together, and if countries acted outside of that, those countries would act together against them. That's a long-term effort. This is not happening overnight, but how we enforce these, how we get these norms first in place, and then make sure that if countries are outliers, that there are consequences.
So, I mean, how does this relate to what we're seeing now in terms of agreements? Because both the UN agreement and the agreement that we saw between the US and China last week fall short of a formal treaty. And I mean, do you see any need or possibility that we could have a treaty or a formal cyber arms control agreement in the future?
So I know there was a lot of reporting that there was going to be a cyber arms control agreement with
There
China.
was, yes.
And that was erroneous reporting, so don't believe everything you read. And that was never true. And in fact, I don't think it makes sense to have a quote-unquote cyber arms control treaty. I don't know what a cyber arm is. I think what we've been focusing on instead is what are the norms, what are the actions, what are the effects that we think that countries, states, should not participate in. There's other actors too. Cybercrime, we've been focusing on the Budapest Convention for Cybercrime. So you deal with different threats in different ways. But I don't think moving to a treaty when you have such quickly evolving technology, A, and B, when you have, I think, a lot of work to do to get countries to agree to these larger norms makes sense.
So when you say you don't know what a cyber arm is, I mean, can you say more about that?
Well, there's a lot of dual-use technologies. I mean, a piece of code could be used for malicious purposes, it could be used for research purposes, it could be used for defensive purposes. And then, how do you actually control that piece of code? So if you're looking at it more in terms of what are the effects you're saying that should be off the table, like attacking critical infrastructure, that's a more logical way to do it, and it helps the conversation. In the nuclear world, it took 40 years to really get to a point where people understood it. We're not going to take 40 years, but it's going to take a little while to get countries to understand both the issues and then move together. And even though some of the more developed countries, I think, have really been discussing this, and this GG had a number of developing countries as well, this is a conversation that's more than just for the developed countries of the world, it's for every country in the world. And it's frankly more than just the governments. I mean, there are concerns that the private sector has, civil society has, so you have to bring them in too.
So you brought up the comparisons with the nuclear discussions, and cyber deterrence is kind of the new hot word on the Hill. And so what is one thing that the U.S. could do better that you would say to have a deterrence strategy that would go a long way towards raising the cost for the attackers?
So there's huge differences, as I think almost anyone will tell you, between the nuclear world and the cyber world. There's attribution differences. You don't see a launch plume when a cyber weapon or a cyber attack happens. So, and attribution is a concern, and there's lots of other issues there. However, I think there are things you can do. First, harden the targets, deterrence by denial. And our previous speaker talked a lot about things that companies and governments can do to make sure that these are harder to get to. If you raise the cost, that's part of deterrence. But also, we're developing a number of tools, and including the sanctions order and others, and in criminal prosecutions, and diplomatic, calling countries out diplomatically in appropriate cases, or other actors, and then again cybercrime and other tools that we have that will bring a cost to the actors doing this. So it's not a cost-free exercise. It is actually something they care about. So all of that is deterrence, but this is still an evolving area.
Okay, great. Well, with that, I do want to open it up to audience questions. So if you could just raise your hand, but also say your name and where you're from. And we have Joe in the back there.
Right, thanks, Sarah. Joe Marks from Politico. Two quick questions. First, at the Senate Armed Services hearing on Tuesday, I suppose, Admiral Rogers and Deputy Secretary of Defense both said pretty explicitly that they believe the threat of sanctions is one major thing that brought China to the table, and I'm on economic hacking. I'm wondering if you could comment on that. Second, the bilateral working group that was announced last Friday is led by DHS and the Justice Department, and is much more focused on cybercrime rather than the whole of government bilateral that we had before the indictments came out in 2014. I'm wondering if you can go over what's I don't want to say better or worse, but what can be accomplished, what can't be, how those two differ, and the credits and debits of both.
So on the first, I'm not going to really go beyond what I said before and what the president has said. Look, he was very clear that we were ready to use tools, that we were ready, that this was a serious concern. I'm not going to speculate about the motivation of our Chinese colleagues beyond that. On the second, I would say, it is significant. There are two actually working groups that were formed. So one that was based on the first commitment to cooperate and to make sure that exchanges of information were happening in terms of investigations. And what was set up is this high-level mechanism with the Attorney General and the Secretary of Homeland Security, plus other agencies, to make sure that that is moving along and making it accountable. But there's also a mechanism that was set up with respect to the discussion of international security and norms, and that is a senior experts group that will discuss that. So I think a lot of those issues, which goes beyond simply norms, but some of the other issues as well, will be captured there. And the fact is we do discuss issues with China in the GGE, in a number of other forums around the world, and ARF and other places. So it's not like there's been no communication with China, but I think it's important, even if we have significant, which we do, disagreements with China, that we have a way to have discussions with them, because what we don't want is misunderstandings that will escalate a possible conflict, and that's one of the reasons we're pursuing these confidence building measures. So again, I think this is something that's probably worthy of follow-up. The visit just happened last week, and we'll go from there, but I think that's about all I can say on this right now.
To clarify, this is a bilateral group?
Yes.
And norms?
Yeah. And international security.
So, yes, right here in the middle.
Hi,
It's in the fact sheet.
I wanted to ask, hi, sorry, Sharon Bovat, Voice of a Moderate. I wanted to ask a question. Actually, it's in reference to the cyber kill chain and the 7 steps. About a year ago, I believe China infected a bunch of routers that were installed in government agencies. And my question is that when you look at that, and you look at the cyber agreement, and you look at the offshoring of the technology that's made, like when you do the router, that's like step 3 in the 7 part of the kill chain. So they've already got to a certain point. And I believe that issue was taken care of with the diplomatic solution. But when you look at those and the offshoring, has that ever been discussed as having certain technology built in America and not sending those jobs to China? Has that ever been discussed, or is that mentioned in any of your discussions?
So let me take that out of the context of China and just say more generally, one of the concerns we have a concern about a number of threats out there. We have concerns about the remote threat, the hacking threat, the insider threat, and the supply chain threat. These are all threats that we see on the technical side. We also have, which I haven't really addressed, the policy threats, where there are countries who want to have a far different view of the internet and want to have more control and want to draw sovereign boundaries around their systems, and that's something that we spend a lot of time on as well. So we are concerned about all of those different issues, and it's something. But on the other hand, the world is globalized. The U.S. doesn't make everything anymore. No country does. Things are all over the place. So you have to do, I think, appropriate risk assessments as companies, as governments, or others are making purchasing decisions. But at the same time, you don't want to be protectionist, and that's one of the concerns we've had about some of the laws, in fact, that have come out of China, where they've wanted, and some other countries, where they wanted to have solely indigenous products. So you need to balance those things. You need to look at the risk. Erin probably can talk a little bit about that as well.
So I can't resist a follow-up on this question, actually. So you're talking about countries that want to have more control over the internet within their borders. And we're, of course, having this encryption debate here at home, where just 2 weeks ago, Passcode had another event with the FBI and DOJ officials who are saying how they would like tech companies to find a way to have, so that the encryption that they deploy on consumer products is not warrant-proof. So, I mean, how does this complicate your discussions with other countries, like, say, China? I mean, the U.S. is pushing back against proposals that would require tech firms to give over encryption keys or install access to let local law enforcement there have access there.
So I think, again, the President's been very clear, and he said this at the Stanford Summit, and he said this since then, that we are very much for encryption, and encryption is an important thing to protect privacy, to protect cybersecurity, and for a whole host of reasons that we think this is very important. At the same time, we are concerned about access to data for the evildoers, the terrorists, the criminals who are trying to take advantage of it, and making sure that we have that access. These are difficult issues. They're difficult technical issues, and what the President's called for is public discussion that we're engaged in now. Now, what I'd say is, there's also a difference, though, when you're trying to access communications for legitimate security purposes, law enforcement reasons, versus when you're trying to access communications because you want to actually curtail criticism of your government, other kinds of freedoms, That's something obviously the U.S. doesn't do, and we're very concerned about that.
Yeah, and there are some who say that that is, a subjective way of, each country would look at its own national security needs differently. And companies, for their part, many of them worry that if this is the policy that the U.S. needs to get access for what it sees as legitimate, that other countries might want things for what they think.
Again, what the debate that's been happening here, and the clear statement that that the president has made is that we do think encryption is important. We do think it protects privacy. We do think, even with these challenges, we think that's true. And so, can we find a way to look at both of those issues, but we're not backing down from encryption as being something that's important to protect privacy and even for issues of cybersecurity.
Okay, well, so any other audience questions? Yes, we have one in the back there.
Hi. Hi, Jeff from Policy Mike. We talked a lot about state-level aggressors in nations like China that have taken more proactive roles there, but one of the things I think you admitted yourself to the more pressing threat is independent actors, individuals, sometimes with difficult, dubious state-sponsored ties, or people acting independently altogether. So how do we right now hold states, even European states, for which this is not, for which a state-level response is not, or policy is not always appropriate? How do we hold those states accountable for properly treating individual aggressors in their jurisdiction against individuals in ours?
So I'd say two things. Back to the larger normative discussion, one of the things that was in that 2013 GG report is that states should not use proxies to do things that states shouldn't be able to do themselves. So that's a larger statement. But more particularly, a lot of these individual actors, and look, I'm a former prosecutor and did cyber crimes for many years, and a lot of the actors we see out there are either sort of lone gunman hackers or transnational organized criminal groups. And I think we've made substantial progress over the last number of years in terms of getting more and more countries to have the right legal frameworks in place, because often these are criminals. And so how do you make sure you go after these criminals and get countries to take this seriously and work together when these are almost always transnational cases? So one is they have to have good laws in place. If they don't have good laws in place, it doesn't matter. Nothing else matters, because if they don't actually punish this conduct, that's a problem. And it used to be that wasn't always true. I remember the I Love You virus many years ago, and it was traced back to a country who didn't have any law punishing that. Now they do. So working with countries to do that has been a priority, and many, many more countries have signed on or emulated the Budapest Convention. The second thing is they need to have trained law enforcement officials to actually do this stuff. And so that's been the other leg of the stool, and there's been a lot of capacity building efforts that we've been involved in, DOJ and others have been involved in. And the third is they have to have the ability to cooperate internationally. So we've created something called a 24/7 network, has over 60 countries in it now. Interpol has a new center out in Singapore that's working on this. Europol's been active in this area. But this is also part of something that we've started just a few years ago. We have all of government bilateral discussions now with a number of countries. I just came back from Finland, where we had our meeting with all of the Nordic and Baltic countries. We had our dialogue with India recently. We're going to have a dialogue with Brazil. I have them with Korea and Japan, with the EU and not others. This is one of the topics that is brought up in that context. And in fact, Aaron Hughes and I were just in Riyadh, where we did one with the GCC countries on cybersecurity. So this is one of the topics that comes up, and we're trying to build more of a cohesive, common response against shared threats on the cybersecurity side and also on the cybercrime side.
Great. Yes, right here in the middle.
Hi, Nick Leiserson with Congressman Langevin office. You mentioned earlier the idea that arms control might be difficult in cyber because of the prevalence of dual-use technologies, and we were looking at effects. And I'm wondering if you could comment then on the Wassenaar arrangement and our accessing to adding some cyber dual-use technologies to that, and whether we might be reconsidering that in a broader framework.
So I think that the Wassenaar, for those who don't know, the Wassenaar arrangement is dealing with export controls on technologies. And recently, a couple of years ago, the Wassenaar Group, which is, I forget how many countries, but includes the US and many other countries. 41. Decided to, for particular classes of possible cyber tools, to create controls on them. And one was tools that could be used by governments to monitor their citizens, essentially, for human rights issues. And the other was malicious tools that could be used to attack systems. So these were not meant and never meant to target legitimate researchers, not meant to target legitimate companies. So there's been, I think, a very robust dialogue going on as those rules have been developed. And Commerce is involved in writing those rules, put out a notice. There have been a lot of comments. There is, I understand, a new version that's going to be coming out. I think, my sense is you can write this in a way that excludes that conduct which you're not trying to get at, but also makes it clear that you don't want these technologies proliferating to regimes who are going to use them in a bad way. And again, this is, I don't want to prejudge Commerce's next version and the comments that are out there, but I do think that this is an important thing to look at.
Even just then, you said, the conduct, and it seems like when you go after the technology, vice the conduct. I mean, I think that. But
you can still write the rules in such a way that what you're doing is you're talking about what the conduct is, and when you grant exceptions, et cetera, you're dealing with that, and that's really what I think Commerce is working on now.
Great, and so we have time for one more question. Anybody else in the audience have a question for Coordinator Painter? Well, if not, then I think we will go on to the next panel. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
Glad to have you.
I should also thank Congressman Langevin for his long interest in this topic. He's been, I think, one of the people who've been interested in this as long as I can remember. Good to see you.
Thanks so much for joining us. Okay, so next up, we are very glad to have Aaron Hughes. He's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Cyber Policy. That means he oversees the development and implementation of cyber policies, strategies, and plans guiding the department's efforts in cyberspace. So thanks so much for joining us here.
Thank you.
And so let's start with a big part of the Pentagon's cyber strategy in cyberspace, which is defending its own networks. But one common problem in cybersecurity is that as defense grows stronger, that adversaries adapt and also find new ways to attack. So how are you seeing the threats to DoD's own networks evolve, and how can the government's own cybersecurity play a role in deterring attacks?
Yeah. So I would say that defense is hard, right? The defenders need to be right 100% of the time, where attackers only need to be right a single time. So I know that Mr. Halverson and the CIO's office are working hard on a cyber culture initiative because the adversaries recognize that our networks are vulnerable to the weakest link, and sometimes because there's humans in the loop, that weakest link is hands on the keyboard. And so we need to improve our cyber culture in the sense of training our users to recognize the threats, because as our cyber culture and hygiene is weak, that allows that threat vector to get access to our networks, and it can defeat any of the multitude of products that we've put in place to defend our network. So I think I would foot stomp Terry Halverson's point that cyber culture and cyber hygiene is important, in combination with just a broader defense in depth methodology.
So how do you think that the Pentagon is doing on its own? We're obviously on the heels of the OPM breach, and we will get to some of that as well. But I mean, what grade would you give the DoD's efforts in this space?
Absolutely. I think there's always room for improvement. This is an area where it's the Secretary's #1 priority is defense. So as we articulate our missions in cyberspace, you'll see that 2 of them relate directly to how well we're defending our networks and systems and helping to defend the nation. I think there's always areas for improvement, and defense, again, is the #1 priority.
So we heard from Chris Painter at State about some norms that the U.S. is working on during peacetime, but with you, I want to get a little bit into conflict time. So DoD's goal is in part to defend the nation against significant cyber attacks, but what exactly does that mean? I mean, how would you describe the threshold for something it would take for DoD to get involved in this?
Absolutely. Now, I think that while we recognize that significant consequence is somewhat squishy in a sense, I think we're looking at area, and we would never want to define a particular threshold, but we're looking for instances where there's potentially loss of life, destruction of property, significant economic consequences, significant foreign policy consequences. But in the sense of how DoD defines our kind of defend the nation mission is really kind of the indications and warning and defense of the country in that gray and red space. Right?
Interesting. So you say you wouldn't ever want to define the threshold. I mean, so is it going to stay squishy for some time, just as a case-by-case basis as things come up?
Squishy in the sense that we would never say this constitutes an act of war versus cyber vandalism versus malicious activity. We'll take each of those significant consequences on a case-by-case basis, evaluating across the criteria that I talked about. So loss of life, destruction of property, economic consequences.
So would you be able to outline, I mean, what at what point it becomes an act of war versus an act of, cyber conflict that's ongoing or cyber espionage?
Yeah, I mean, act of war will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis as decided by the president. I think, again, taking into account those dimensions that I defined, we would evaluate on a case-by-case basis.
So what about specifically an attack on a private sector target? I mean, we saw sanctions in response to Sony, which was a destructive attack on a company, but it was an entertainment company and not, a critical infrastructure target. So I mean, when is military action an option? And does it matter which part of the country that nation states are targeting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes to our broader deterrence policy. I think our deterrence policy is a whole of government approach. In some instances, there will be a military response. In some instances, the State Department and then diplomatic avenues will be opened up. In other areas, there'll be sanctions that will be considered. In other areas, there'll be criminal. So I think that it's, our response to any particular instance, again, is case by case and whole of government.
And so do you think that deterrence is possible here? I mean, we talked a little bit in the earlier panel about comparisons with the Cold War and deterrence for nuclear weapons, and it was very clear what the outcome would be if there was a nuclear strike that was launched. But I mean, what makes it so complicated here from your perspective, and what more does the U.S. need to do?
Yeah, and I think I'm assuming a lot of folks in the audience here might have tracked Secretary Work's hearings at the Senate and the House over the past couple days. And I think our deterrence policy and posture is an area where we're continuing to refine and improve, right? So I mean, we characterize cost imposition as being the #1 point, and I think in order to do that, we need to have good denial of adversaries that are trying to get into our networks. We need to ensure our networks are resilient, and then the cost imposition, we need to make sure that we have appropriate response options. I think the strategy articulated that we released in April, and we're continuing to build those response capabilities that could provide the Defense Department's component to that deterrence posture.
So what's one concrete thing that DoD is working on in this space towards deterrence? Could you point to some specific effort that's part of your plan?
Yeah, no, I won't get into specific options that we're developing, but across a broad range of threat actors and scenarios, we're continuing to plan for a variety of threats and provide decision makers the response options that can be called upon when necessary.
And so you also have this cybersecurity scorecard thing that's going on. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that's an initiative that Terry Halverson's leading out of the CIO's office. It helps take a look at the health of the broader department's networks and systems, and that's something that both the Secretary and the Deputy Secretary and the department leadership take extremely seriously, again, because defense of our networks is #1 priority, and so they are having a constant cadence to review and refine the data in that scorecard. And it helps improve the broader network health, so that's a key initiative for Mr. Halverson in the CIO office.
So beyond defense, I mean, we had Admiral Mike Rogers, who's the head of Cyber Command, talking earlier this year about how we're at a tipping point where the focus on defense isn't really working, and that it might be time to consider boosting the military's offensive capability in this space. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that we've publicly articulated for the first time in the strategy this year that providing response options for the Secretary and senior leadership is a key component of what we're doing. And I think by publicly stating that in an unclassified strategy, we're articulating that response options are part of our broader strategy. And so we're continuing to develop capabilities that can be used across a broad range of threat actors and scenarios. And so yes, we're continuing to develop capabilities across offense and defense to support decision making.
And so how does attribution and the challenges of figuring out who is actually behind a cyber attack play into this? Because in OPM, for instance, officials have said that there's been no definite statement about who is exactly behind it because it hasn't met this criteria of knowing, the exact geographical location of where the attack came from or who exactly was doing that attack or behind it. So how do some of these complexities play into formulating a response, and especially a military response if you're talking about taking offensive action?
Is your question, how do we use attribution to support our broader response? Attribution
that, but
is a
also
component.
the challenges of figuring this out, and if you're saying that offense is part of part of a strategy to have certain options. It seems like knowing exactly who you're targeting would be a pretty big part of that.
Yeah, no, I think attribution goes into how we consider deterrence, because if we can attribute, in some instances publicly, in some instances privately, who's executing these attacks, maybe that loss of anonymity stops them from attacking in the future. I think our attribution capabilities are continuing to improve, and again, we bring in whole of government and the intelligence community and the investigative community to support those attribution efforts.
And so what's interesting here too is that you're starting to see private companies that are just increasingly attacked by nation-state-backed hackers. And there's this question about whether the Second Amendment, should extend into cyberspace here too. Do you think that private companies should have the right to hack back and take action on their own?
I think hacking back that's a challenging question, right? So there's many complexities in this domain. It is already difficult for nations to discern nation-state attacks versus individual actors versus non-state actors. I think that we would further complicate that environment by advocating for private companies to hack back. So I don't think by any means we support hacking back, because I think that it's already a complex domain, and trying to determine if a private company hacking back is just acting as a proxy for a state actor further complicates. So I think that while I recognize the threat that private companies are under, I think they should leverage the law enforcement and in some instances the support that Department of Homeland Security can provide in helping them to mitigate and respond to attacks on their data and systems.
Can you expand on that a little bit? If it's an interesting concept, because if you have private companies that are, carrying out their own attacks, whether it's to take back stolen data or, just stop an attack in a way. What type of issue would that pose for the U.S. military trying to look at this landscape?
I think the cyber domain is one where the escalation parameters and framework are unknown, and so if a private company were to, again, even if it's just disrupting the data that has already been stolen, there's the potential for a misunderstanding of what that is by a foreign entity, a foreign government, which further escalates what's happening in the domain. And I think, again, that would make it difficult for the Department of Defense should another country escalate in terms of what our response to that might need to be. So again, I would not advocate for hacking back by any means.
So what will a future conflict look like? How are we already seeing, and how do you expect to see more so in 10 years, in 20, how cyber weapons or operations are being integrated?
Yeah, and I think in any operation, right, across any domain, there will be a cyber component, because I think a nation state would be foolish in some sense to not take advantage of the asymmetry of the domain to try to affect your objectives, be it air, land, sea, space, through cyber, right? There's no geographic boundaries. You're able to touch a variety of things. So I think cyber, the Department of Defense is building in cyber capabilities and cyber options across a variety of our plans. Cyber planners are integrated into our combatant commands to support that planning process. And I think as senior leaders understand capabilities that the cyber domain can provide, we'll continue to refine and improve that in terms of how it's fully integrated across all the spectrums and domains.
So speaking of asymmetry, we had Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Martin Dempsey, saying how U.S. military superiority does not extend into cyberspace, and so do you think that it is possible for the U.S. to have an advantage definitively over other countries in this space, or does this asymmetry in this type of conflict mean that attackers will always have the advantage no matter who they are?
So I think attackers, generally speaking, will have the advantage, but that could be the United States with that advantage as well. I think that the innovation that we have here in the United States and the brain power and the will to develop the next generation of capabilities will hopefully far exceed what our adversaries are able to bring to the fight. I do believe that cyber criminals and the dark web do bring a dimension that make it difficult, especially for private companies in instances where there's cyber crime for financial gain or for the exploitation of personally identifiable information. But I think the United States will continue to lead out. We recognize the importance of this domain. We're investing in the build of the cyber force. Admiral Rogers is a great leader for Cyber Command and the broader cyber enterprise, and the 6,200 people. I mean, those are real people with real skills that are executing operations and building that force on a day-to-day basis.
And so we had in the earlier panel a pretty long conversation about norms and how the US and other international powers are working together to create rules of the road in this space. But what about countries that are not, or what about people and countries who are maybe more unpredictable in this space? I mean, you have non-nation states who are, militants who are starting to ramp up their own capabilities online, and you have countries like North Korea, for instance, which have, some of this tech. I mean, how significant is having norms if you also, have a lot of people in the space who might not have an interest traditionally in abiding by them?
Yeah. I'd say we look at threats across a variety of actors and a variety of dimensions. We need to be prepared to defend from the nation states that might want to propagate physical attacks through the cyber domain, but I think that having a set of norms similar to what we're hoping to reach agreements with the Chinese on are just as important, because it helps the public understand that the stability of the internet is important. We don't want a militarization of the internet by any means, and to the degree that we can agree with the Chinese, hopefully in this instance, that they won't support cyber espionage for the benefit of their commercial or state-run enterprises, I think that's a norm that we want to drive towards.
So on IP theft, just because you brought it up,
Yep.
I mean, are you optimistic that China will hold up its end of that deal?
I think the Secretary said it over the past couple of days. I mean, we agreed need to be confidence building measures. The proof will be in the pudding. We hope that the agreement, because it comes at the highest levels of the Chinese government, will be one that they adhere to. But again, we need to have, as Admiral Rogers and D&I Clapper said, a trust but verify method to verify that they are adhering to the agreements that President Xi and President Obama made.
So I just want to switch to a different topic, and that's hackers and how hackers and developers of 0 days might play into the cyber strategy. I mean, if the US just offered to pay the most money for vulnerabilities, I mean, couldn't it just improve cybersecurity for everyone? Just a big bug bounty for...
That's an interesting question. I know that right now that and for a lot of our defensive tools, we're collaborating with industry. We're trying to learn from industry by sending our folks to some of the hacker conferences so we can understand the different threat vectors that the hacker community is using to get into to vehicles, to get into the Internet of Things. And I think there's a true collaboration that the government and industry need to have in this space, especially with the white and gray hat hacker community that want to publicly identify the bugs and vulnerabilities to improve security for everybody.
So speaking of going to cybersecurity conferences and sending people there,
Yeah.
I mean, the government and the military is in a pretty big competition for talent among with the same people that Silicon Valley is pulling from, and especially when it comes to security. I mean, and Ash Carter, the defense secretary, has also made a big personal push out west to woo Silicon Valley, if you will. So do you think that the government can get the tech it needs to support these goals and the strategy?
So I think the tech is one thing,
And
but I
the
mean,
talent.
again, the human capital is another, right? But there's one thing that the Defense Department, the intelligence community, the other areas of our government can pull on, and that's the mission, right? So you can't get this mission anywhere else in the legal context to be able to do computer network operations, right? And so I think that there is a strong affinity across the American people, from people that have these computer skills and the hacking talent, that they want to be part of that mission. And I think Admiral Rogers has stated that on numerous instances that is what keeps his people. They can obviously make more money elsewhere, but to the degree that we can have and present an interesting mission for them to work on will be key. In terms of recruiting talent, I think we make sure that folks are aware of that mission. I think that we are starting to evaluate different hiring authorities that can help the permeability of forces and people between government, military, and industry, and make it easier for people to go back and forth between those different silos. And I think that we need to continue to evolve to make sure that we can stay the best cyber force in the world going forward.
So how is the push out west going? I mean, what's the progress update with that?
Yeah, so I mean, the Secretary and Deputy Secretary have both been out to visit the new Defense Innovation Unit experimental DIUX. I think that's meant to be a footprint for the department in Silicon Valley to engage with industry, with academia, both small companies, large companies, Fortune 100, Fortune 50. And I think it's meant to educate on what the problems the department is trying to solve without having to come back to the Pentagon. So a bastion of information for those small companies out there. I'm not privy to the status and how many people they have, but I know that they've had their ribbon cutting and they're working to engage both the venture capital community as well as tech companies on the West Coast.
And so also in terms of the Pentagon's relationship with industry, I mean, what is the Pentagon looking at in terms of its own supply chain? The defense industrial base has long been a target of espionage, and how are you guys assessing this threat, and what steps are you taking to make sure that the products that you guys have and use are secure?
Absolutely. And this goes to, again, I don't mean to keep coming back to it, but the Secretary's #1 charge, again, for our cyber and cybersecurity workforce is the defense of our networks, systems, and data. And with that comes the viability and integrity of the supply chain. I know Undersecretary Kendall and the AT&L organization takes that very seriously. We're going through initiatives right now to evaluate the assurance and reliability and integrity of our weapon system, and I think they're doing that as well in the supply chain domain.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it's the threats would be twofold. I mean, one, it would be the possible vulnerabilities in weapon systems that the Pentagon is using, but also having other countries replicate them. So, I mean, can you outline some of these?
Well, the replication goes to the theft of our intellectual property, right? I think the administration has been very public in saying that's a threat to our national security, right? The viability of our tech industry and our IP that's taken decades to build and maintain, that's what we hold near and dear. And to the degree that that is stolen for the benefit of foreign companies, that again is a threat to our national security.
So what would you say is the biggest threat to national security in cyberspace? If you could point to one aspect.
Yeah, so one aspect would be challenging, but I think at the very basic level, I've talked a little bit about making sure the broader populace has the cyber basics down, right? Because that's the first
broader populace of DoD.
Well, broader
or
populace of
just.
I think it's a shared threat between industry, government, and private citizens, right? Cyber is not going anywhere. I always hear people refer to it as a thing like it's peanut butter that you spread. But I think if you talk about a specific threat, and I think that D&I Clapper said this the other day, we've gone from having our data stolen and exfiltrated in some instances for the benefit of criminals or otherwise. But I think what we need to be prepared for is when they don't steal that data, but they manipulate that data, and how we determine that the data has been manipulated. And that's the kind of reliability and integrity that we need to worry about. I think that some of the tools right now maybe wouldn't detect that manipulation of data, and that could pose a bigger threat that adversaries could have on the networks.
Very interesting. So I do want to open it up to audience questions. And again, if you could raise your hand and say your name and where you're from. And yes, on the left over here, we have our first question.
Hello, I'm Wyatt Hoffman from the Carnegie Endowment. This issue of data manipulation that you brought up at the end, which Admiral Rogers and Clapper both talked about as sort of the next big concern that they have on the horizon. How do you deal with this in terms of preventing it or deterring it? Because you have a situation where it sort of falls in traditional espionage, but it's also sort of sabotage and an act of war. It's sort of ambiguous in that sense. It's something that, like you said, it's sort of hard to detect, and we don't necessarily have that technology, but at the same time, it's hard to develop norms against it. So how do you deal with that? Is it through deterrence and threatening to punish an adversary that we detect doing that? Or is it trying to harden the resilience of our systems, or what?
Yeah, no, I think you're answering the question for me. I think it's both the denial and the resilience, right? So if we can quickly restore data that we do detect has been manipulated or has been exfiltrated. I think that's the resiliency of both the data and the networks. But first and foremost, we want to deny the adversary the advantage of getting into our networks. And broader deterrence is the cost imposition if they were to, and make it more difficult for them to access. So I think it's a combination of the resilience and denial of the access.
Thank you.
And yes, we have, maybe just, if you really want to back up, there's one person behind you who has a question. Zach?
Thank you for being here today, Mr. Hughes. My name is Andrew Flick from Tenable Network Security. Earlier you mentioned raising the cost for attacks, and I was wondering what you think the most effective way for government or enterprise to raise the costs for people to attack their networks.
Cost imposition has a variety of dimensions, and I think it'll vary based on the adversary, right? So non-state actors, they're not going to necessarily care if you're going to levy economic sanctions. I think state actors might care about economic sanctions and physical response options. I think, raising the cost is goes across a number of dimensions. I mean, some people will care about criminal indictments, economic sanctions, and military response options. I think all of that needs to be taken into consideration as you consider what your cost imposition strategy is going to be.
Okay. And yes, around corner here.
My name is Alexis Lavi with Fortilla Solutions, a private cybersecurity firm in the area. During the past discussion, the role of DHS has not come up, but a lot of engagement that you've mentioned and Mr. Painter mentioned involves DHS's role. So how is DHS going to be incorporated into America's cyber strategy?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you for bringing that up. DHS is a great partner for DoD, for State Department, and others. When we think about the bifurcation of responsibilities in defense of the country, DoD plays a key role in defending kind of the .gov space as well as the department's critical infrastructure. Folks always seem to think that DoD has that kind of broader mandate, but DHS really has the mission to support our civilian agencies, to support our critical infrastructure, and to be the point of collaboration for other sectors such as the financial sector, energy sector, power, et cetera. Department of Defense is contribution to kind of the whole of nation, whole of government cyber strategy, again, is to provide the indications and warning and to defend from the cyber attacks before they get to us domestically. But that's when Department of Justice, Department of Homeland Security have the response when there is an event domestically. So FBI would have the lead from an investigative perspective. DHS would have the lead in the event that it's on a .gov or critical infrastructure industry response and support there.
Okay. And yes, up here again.
Sharon Bovak, voice of a moderate. A retired general expressed a concern about too many hackers. Every branch has their hackers. The Army's have a hacker, the Navy has hackers, because they have different weapon systems. They need to see if they've been vulnerable. And as they're exploring, it's like exploratory surgeries. Too many exploratory surgeries could lead, because not all exploratory surgeries are safe. And recently at the Capitol, they were offering congressional staffers to go witness live hacking. Now, it really wasn't hacking, it was the exploratory surgery. So my question is there is a need to maybe consolidate or regulate, because they are hiring people, and there really is concern over the lack of oversight of who is getting access to these tools to do this.
So the construct of the Cyber Mission Force is to ensure all of the different services are trained to the same standard and work under the same procedures. So I wouldn't agree that there are differences between what the Army can do, what the Navy can do, and what the Air Force can do. The Cyber Mission Force is a total mission force, 6,200 people geographically distributed under the leadership of Admiral Rogers and others. We have a construct for what our team structure would look like. There's folks in the Cyber Mission Force that are dedicated to cyber protection or more the defensive mission. There's folks that we've called combat mission teams that are supporting our combatant commands geographically distributed, and there's national mission teams which have kind of the cyber on cyber mission. They're all trained to the same standard and have their tasking that flows down in a very standard way. So I don't think, at least from if you were to talk to Admiral Rogers or General McLaughlin, the leaders of Cyber Command, that they would agree that it is haphazard by any means. I think that there's some the very keen standards in place for how we do cyber operations in the military.
And yes, right up here.
Hi, Mike Coombs with Global Cyber Strategies. A couple of quick questions, since I was in the department looking for Harry Alverson up until recently.
Okay. Yeah.
So the first one is very easy. Has the duties of the Principal Cyber Advisor changed to you from Eric Rosenbach? The second one is, we've made a lot of progress in the last probably 12 months. You're relatively new to the department. What are we doing to try and change the culture overall? Not just the culture in the cyber culture, but the culture of acquisition, the culture of innovation. Because even with DIUX,
Yep.
we have to incorporate that somehow, and the bureaucracy of the Pentagon is not changeable easily.
Yeah. So to answer your first question about the Principal Cyber Advisor, that responsibility has not fallen to me. So Acting Assistant Secretary for Defense Tom Atkin has the acting PCA title right now. I work for Tom Atkin. With respect to propagating a broader cultural change, I think our cyber strategy tries to define certain areas where we can improve. If you've worked in the Pentagon, you know it's a large corporation. I think it would be Fortune 1, as Terry Halverson says. And there are many areas where individual pockets of innovation are changing. I think there's more, there are novel ways with which Terry and Frank Kendall's organization are able to collaborate with industry without long drawn-out procurement cycles. I think we're obviously trying to drive, cyber awareness and cultural change in that area, but it's going to be a long process, and that's why Secretary Carter has made it one of his key initiatives that hopefully over the course of the next 20 months and into the next administration, some of those will take hold.
Great. I think we have time for one last question. And yes, I think right up here.
Hi, Eric Geller from the Daily Dot. Obviously, the Pentagon does cyber training exercises like conventional weapons. I'm just wondering if you can talk about what the U.S. has learned from other countries that might face different threat scenarios that we're not facing yet, or that we haven't thought as much about. What have we gained from those training exercises and that collaboration?
Is your question in the sense of which foreign training exercises that our cyber mission force has participated in?
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I'm not aware of what foreign exercises we've participated in. I know that our Cyber Guard exercise that we do annually has brought in some of our Five Eye partners and other foreign partners, and it's always good because we fight in other domains with those partners. It's important for them to understand how we do that in the cyber domain as well. So I know that we've collaborated closely with some of their Five Eye partners in that particular cyber exercise, but I'm sorry, I'm not aware of what we're doing in terms of pushing our cyber forces to other foreign exercises that they might host.
If you could just talk about sort of Cyber Guard and sort of what we gain from that. I mean, there's a sense that sort of the U.S. is the leader in cyberspace, but obviously we always have something to learn. So what are we gaining from Cyber Guard?
Yeah, no, Cyber Guard is an exercise where we use it as both a mission qualification exercise for some of our cyber forces. We use it as a mechanism to collaborate with industry. I think we actually had folks from the power industry as well as financial sector participating this year, and bringing in whole of government participation from FBI and DHS. I believe the scenario was an attack on critical infrastructure and how FBI would play their investigative role, DHS would play their support role, and then DoD would play a supporting role for potential forensics or defense from future attacks. So I think those exercises are always evolving, but it's good to make sure that we understand the lines of communication and the capabilities that both our industry partners, foreign partners, and whole of government partners can bring to the cyber fight.
I actually have one last question for you. So part of what Passcode does is tackle and sometimes dispel FUD, in this space. And I find it really interesting that, both this discussion and also the discussion with Chris Painter, haven't really focused on the cyber apocalypse, cyber Pearl Harbor rhetoric or scenario that, you hear so often, especially sometimes on the Hill. Yeah. So, I mean, why do you think that, why do you think that this might not be the biggest threat? I mean, this is something that officials sometimes talk about, and what do you make of all of the rhetoric about the threats in this space?
So I think everyone recognizes the cyber threat, and I think I kind of chuckle when I hear people feel like when they articulate it, it's a new thing, right? This is something that's been going on for many years. I mean, I give the anecdote, my 95-year-old grandmother knows that her grandson works in cybersecurity and what that means for the nation. I think that while we need to be cognizant that some countries have the ability to propagate a kind of mass critical infrastructure-like event in cyber, I think that the countries that have that capability understand the escalation that would create. And so I think that going back to your point about the norms, that's why D&I Clapper and Admiral Rogers have said that is not what keeps them up every night. That is something that they are cognizant of and tracking the indications and warning of if an event like that were to happen. But it's kind of the middle tier of events, continuing exfiltration of our data, manipulation of our data, and some of the state and non-state actors that might be able to do destruction on a little bit of a lower level that is something that they continue to track. I think while I don't want to discount that there could be a cyber apocalypse, no countries have that capability, but hopefully folks understand how that would escalate, and we wouldn't want to see that from any dimension.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
Very glad to have you. So next up we have our panel. I think we need a couple more chairs. We will
Excuse me.
grab
Let me back up.
these guys. Okay. Oh, thank you.
A couple more.
I think it's just, one more. That's not great. Okay.
Showtime.
Thank you.
I think everything else is in their hands.
Great. Thank you. Great. Hi, good to have you.
I'll sit in the middle.
Yeah, have a seat.
Oh, boy, am I wired.
Thanks for joining us. Glad to have you.
Pleasure. Now, are you going to ask each of us separately, or are you just going to throw the questions off and we're going to play?
Some for each of you. Great. Okay, so next up we have our keynote panel. We have some great guests here as well. We have next to me Angela McKay. She is Director of Microsoft's Government Security Policy and Strategy team. We have Martin Libicki, who is a Senior Management Scientist at RAND, and Eric Novotny, Senior Advisor for Digital Media and Cybersecurity at the State Department, and also Professor at American University. So we have a lot of different viewpoints on this panel. We've heard a lot of interesting topics of discussion. So I have some questions for everybody, some individual questions for you guys on what you're working on, and then again we will open it up to audience questions. So I guess first up, just because there was so much discussion about China and the agreement between the US and China on not to steal or support stealing intellectual property, what do you guys think? Is it a good step towards creating a norm, or is this an unenforceable waste of time?
Could be both.
Martin, you want to start? You seem to have the most.
Could be both. It was, if you're an analyst and you've lost the capacity for being surprised, you're not a good analyst anymore. And I have to say that agreement that was generated last week on Friday was a surprise to me. And it was a surprise to me because the Chinese, in a relatively small number of days, basically signed up to a list of norms that was exactly what the United States was pushing and not at all what China was themselves interested in. So I ended up saying, what's going on? And I concluded first of all, I concluded it's too soon to tell. And a lot of people around town have come to this conclusion. And then I've concluded there are a lot of different ways of explaining this. The most obvious way of explaining it is they have no intention of abiding by these things, okay? We in the United States somehow convinced ourselves that the Chinese view of cyber espionage is it's okay to do it on national security grounds, that it's as good to do it on national security grounds as it does to do for economic purposes. We make a distinction. We believe that they thought it was the same thing. But in fact, that was never the Chinese formal statement. Their formal statement is, we don't do any of this sort of stuff,
Right.
which of course we don't believe, and they of course continue to maintain. So for the president of China to come in and say, well, we certainly aren't going to do this, is no contradiction, because they deny doing everything.
Right.
And in fact, most of the impact from the indictment of the PLA-5 back in the middle of last year has been to say, hey, we got to get better at this, right? A couple months ago, FBI Director Comey said, you know, the Chinese are like drunken burglars. And that was deeply insulting to them. But they didn't, so they vowed to us not to become burglars, but they vowed to themselves not to do so much drinking. In other words, they want to get their operational
We're
security.
still in metaphor land here.
No. Well, yes, I'm not. Yes, it's, that particular one is a metaphor.
Okay.
But it's important, I think, to them that they get their operational security better.
Okay.
In other words, it's not that they don't intend to do it so much as they don't intend to get caught nearly as often.
And so, Eric, what do you think? You want to jump in here, either from your State Department hat or your American University hat?
I think at one level, recognizing that this is a problem and deserves some dialogue in the whole constellation of diplomatic and bilateral issues is an important development. You know, whether or not you believe that it can be enforced or whether there's a charade behind it, the fact that this issue has come up to the fore and is now part of the agenda, I think is an important recognition. Having said that, I think what I would also say here is that even if we had an arrangement where we each promised not to do this to one another, or in the case of the Chinese doing it to us, that in the context of cyber attacks or cyberspace, it doesn't remove other ways that intellectual property can be compromised. I mean, there are many examples. One famous case in the chemical industry where an American company built a production plant in China with the idea of serving the domestic Chinese market, only to find that in another city an identical plant was being constructed with the exact same architecture and engineering principles to compete with the very plant that the Americans were investing in. So while the cyberspace dimension is certainly an important one, it's not the only one, and it's not the only method by which intellectual property can be compromised.
Yeah. That's a really interesting point. And so, Angela, what do you think? You know, from a company perspective, how did you view the agreement from last week?
Yeah, so not just speaking about the agreement from last week, but broader on the conversation of cybersecurity norms, we think that it is really important progress, much like Eric said, that governments are having this conversation about what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior in cyberspace. I would agree with my colleagues here that, you know, the devil's in the details of accountability, but the fact that this has risen to the level of a conversation between states and that there are now clear statements of intent is demonstrable progress in the environment.
But so why is it so important, you know, to a company? I mean, just to, I think a lot of people in our audience probably, you know, they do come from companies, we've heard them in the questions, but I mean, what does, you know, this nation-to-nation conduct and agreements or lack of agreements, you know, how does that impact your life?
Well, so what we're really talking about is trust in the global ICT industry. And so that is the challenge that we are facing, and that's one of the reasons that norms are so important. And notice I said trust in the global ICT industry. It's not just about trust in US industry. We have, as Chris raised earlier, a globalized marketplace. And when there are not kind of clear boundaries of what is acceptable and unacceptable, you start to have loss of consumer, enterprise, and government trust in products and services, and then we won't be able to reap the economic benefits and all of the innovations that have continued to be driven by cyberspace.
Eric, you look like you have something you'd like to add.
Yeah, I would agree with Angela on that, but I think it goes far beyond that, because what we're looking at is in the question of trust in products and in services and in networks. It transcends the entire infrastructure that we've built, that we've come to know as the internet, but also in terms of mobile communications, in terms of the Internet of Things. It's way beyond just trust in industry, but it's trust in this worldwide global infrastructure that we've built and are attempting to maintain under conditions of instability in cyberspace. So we have to be mindful of the fact that these kinds of discussions and so forth are extremely important to keep the integrity of this infrastructure and to try and make it work given all of the security vulnerabilities that we're aware of.
Right, and so we heard from Aaron, the last topic of discussion, just about how some countries that have these kinds of capabilities to carry out damaging attacks on the U.S. might not have the will to do that, and we're kind of existing in the space that's below that level of all-out war. I mean, so Martin, you're writing a textbook on cyber warfare.
That's true.
At what point do we have, does it turn from cyber espionage or cyber conflict into cyber war? What is cyber war?
Well, first of all, you have to make a distinction between cyber espionage and cyber attack. Almost everything that we're talking about today is cyber espionage. I go into your computer, I take information out, you can't tell, because your computer's running the same as it always did, okay? Now, when you're talking about cyber attacks, we have seen remarkably few cyber attacks. We have seen DDoS attacks, some of them state-sponsored, most of them not state-sponsored. We have seen a number of attacks that have been used to basically trash computers. The Saudi Aramco, RASGAS, a North Korean attack, not only on the United States, but even more so on South Korea, okay? There have been, I would say, almost 2 cases of a cyber attack actually used to break something. One of them was Stuxnet, and the other, which I say is almost because I don't have the details, is an attack on a German blast furnace that was reported in late last year, okay? Not any single one of these attacks has created costs that have exceeded $100 million. Now, when you talk about war, you're talking about an enterprise where, forget the lives lost, just in terms of the money expended, you're easily in the billions and tens and hundreds and even more billions of dollars. So what we've seen in cyber so far is far, far lower than what we have seen in physical combat. And to take what's taken place in cyber and say, well, this is cyber war, okay, I think is at very least grossly premature.
Interesting. So would you judge it then by the outcome, either lives lost or amount of money? I mean, is there a dollar amount that you can put on when it's, conflict or war?
Well, there was something called the Tallinn Manual, which was written by a number of lawyers under the auspices of NATO, which basically took a look at the application of the law of armed conflict. And they came out with a 200-page volume. Very erudite. I'm sure these guys knew what they were doing. But the fact is that according to the laws of armed conflict, if you haven't hurt anybody and you haven't physically broken anything, it's not combat.
Yeah.
It just doesn't qualify. So you had a 200-page manual basically about nothing.
Right.
Or about nothing that we have yet to see.
Well, sure someone there wrote it is listening to this and no. But,
and you're good lawyers. You're all good lawyers if you're out there in the background.
So
it's just the nature of the law they were interpreting.
Something that you do see in cyberspace that is complicated is you have nation state-backed hackers attacking private companies, and some of these distinctions are a little bit blurred. I mean, not just in the case of Sony, but I'm sure you guys see, different attacks, daily, weekly. So can you tell me a little bit about the threats facing your company, and do you want to see the U.S. government or the U.S. military take a bigger role to protect the private sector in this space?
So a couple of things. Obviously, we see a steadily rising increase in attacks over time. I love the line, the security researcher community has been saying for the longest time, we see an increasing number and sophistication of cyber attacks over time. And there we have, however, seen an inflection point, and Marty started to raise some of these different scenarios. When you move into destructive attacks, that's an inflection point. It was not against a critical infrastructure, so it's not quite the same. But as you start to look at that escalation path, that is an inflection point in the types of attacks. I mean, when we're thinking about attacks, it's a range of actors. We're thinking of everything from the individual hacker, organized cyber crime, conflict, and state actor. When you think about the role of government here, and I think this is a really important consideration, I think it would be problematic to think that the government should come in on the horses and respond to every single cyber attack that is going on. And so I think that's actually a very difficult construct, and it's one where I think the rule set is still evolving, and reasons why documents and consistent policy positions, not only from the US government, but from other governments on how they see their role, and putting that out in a transparent light really helps create more certainty in the environment.
So why problematic? Problematic because they shouldn't be involved, or because they won't get there in time?
Problematic because I think that you are working on to both affect the economic incentives and to deal with ultimately things that rise above what may be commercially reasonable. And that's, that's not as actually every single panel has said so far, those are not very distinct lines, right? It's not like, here's the line of exact consequences, and that's why it's problematic to move between the two spaces. One of the reasons you don't want to say that government should come in on the horses and respond to everything is because then what are the right market incentives for industry to continue to improve its defenses? At the same time, you couldn't say government should never be involved, because there are scenarios that exceed commercially reasonable. There are scenarios that are state actions against the private sector that ultimately are in the space of conflict and not just improving your defenses.
So Eric, what do you think? Whose responsibility should it be?
Yeah, I think if you accept a defense in depth, layered defense model, you have different responsibilities for different kinds of threats with different kinds of consequences. And in that respect, let me just address the threshold question first. The United Nations Charter is actually fairly clear on what constitutes an armed attack. It's an attack against the territorial integrity or political independence of a nation state. And that has been the threshold question for the last 65 years or so. The Tallinn Manual reflects that. So Martin's right in that respect. It's a fairly high threshold. In terms of looking at the kinds of threats, there are opportunistic threats, which would be something like, oh, your critical infrastructure, your electric power grid is vulnerable, therefore I'm just going to go ahead and try to make mischief with it, as opposed to targeted attacks, which may be directed at a particular actor or in the context of a larger conflict situation. If there were military operations engaged by the major players in the South China Sea, you can almost guarantee that either before, during, and perhaps after the start of hostilities, that there would be a significant cyber component to that. That's a very, very different thing than saying that Microsoft is on their own, in trying to defend themselves against the Chinese cyber army with 100,000 people working 24/7 to infiltrate these systems. So you can't be expected to defend yourself at that level, right? But at the same time, you can do things that are going to help protect your customers and the integrity of your products, and that's probably where the division of responsibility and resources should be placed.
How many people work for Microsoft?
We have a little bit over 100,000 people.
Okay, your 100,000 people can beat the China's 100,000 people any day of the week. I have no doubts about that. I used to say in the mid-90s that far more consequential decisions that affect cybersecurity are made in Washington State than Washington, D.C. And I really have no reason to change that. Maybe last Friday will cause me to change that, but I doubt it.
So speaking of, the power of private industry, I mean, do you, Martin, think that they should have the ability to hack back? Should they be able to take action in their own hands to solve this as they see fit?
There's a little part of me that says yes. There's
Really?
a big part
All
of me
right.
that says no.
Is Aaron Hughes still? No? Yeah.
No, I was listening. I was listening
Yeah.
to his answer on this thing, and basically for that reasons, it makes a messy world that much messier. Okay, I mean, in the nuclear business, we'd always say, well, we didn't give France nuclear weapons, but boy, that's really going to complicate what the Soviet Union did, right? But it also complicates our life as well. And the one thing we don't want to happen is, okay, something happens to an American company. The American company blames, say, China, right? The American company hacks back at China. China says, well, it was clearly a proxy for the US government. And it might be US policy not to have responded in that particular, but all of a sudden we don't have a choice anymore. And the Chinese have a view, which is incorrect but almost unshakable on their parts, that Microsoft is an arm of the US government. As long, as many years as Microsoft is saying, no, we're not, you can't quite convince these guys. Because if the situations were reversed, of course, we'd say of course. By the way, we have the notion that Huawei is an arm of the Chinese government. So, this goes both ways.
Interesting.
Yeah,
What do you think?
I would just reinforce what Aaron said and actually what Martin is saying here as well. I think the private sector taking actions to hack back would significantly complicate what is already a very complicated risk environment. And coming from the point of view of thinking about vulnerabilities and management of these issues, even when you have sophisticated states who are building cyber weapons and ultimately trying to maintain consistency with the law of armed conflict and law of countermeasures and using appropriate distinction and discrimination, once a piece of malware is out in the environment and people can understand the vulnerabilities that it uses, those are reused by other actors. And so not only is it that individual act that complicates and escalates the risk environment, is the reuse of those same techniques and practices that also further complicates the environment.
Interesting. And so you brought up this question too about attribution in this discussion as well, which I think we can't really get away from. I mean, how could we see better attribution techniques to help deter cyber attacks? I mean, from the government perspective, but also how can the private sector work together with government to try to address this problem, determine the right response? Eric?
Yeah, there's still a lot of debate about the place of attribution. You can find people in the defense and intelligence communities who will maintain that the attribution problem has largely been solved. I'm not sure that's entirely true. But to me, in classic cybersecurity terms, authentication is probably a significant priority here because there is a lot of legitimate business that has to go on. You have to buy books from Amazon. You have to engage in paying your bills online. You have to download patches from software that you have purchased under license. And that has to be done in a manner that guarantees integrity. So while attribution from the standpoint of trying to find actors who are engaged in this kind of mischief is important, on the positive side, I think there needs to be a lot more work in just ensuring the integrity that what I'm getting from somebody else is really from them, and I can trust that relationship. And if that's under attack, all the attribution in the world may not help.
And maybe just to add something here, there have been considerable improvements in attribution over time. But I think one of the things that gets a little lost in this environment is the difference between, if you will, technical attribution and what one might call either policy or political attribution. Those are different thresholds, right? There are a lot of people who can see what is going on in the technical environment. But for example, my organization is not going to be one that goes out into the naming and shaming, because these are all our customers, and that's not going to benefit the environment. I do think that it is very important that we do use information on attribution to, wrapping back to the initial presentation from Greg, let it inform what we understand about threat intelligence and how you improve your defenses over time. So it's not just about naming and shaming and attribution, it's also using that information to improve your defenses over time.
Interesting. So what more can the U.S. government do with private companies, maybe to take some of those technical issues of attribution and blend it with the policy level of deciding actually what to do about it?
Well, that's a space where I would say, again, my organization is not going to get into the position of going into attribution. These are all of our customers. What we're going to be doing is working to help improve the security of our products and services, working with our customers to help improve their defenses, including governments, and leaving this, informing and supporting a conversation between states on appropriate behavior, but on exactly what that is, I'm going to leave that to the states.
Martin?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things about attribution. Attribution not followed by actions doesn't do very much. We're well past the naming and shaming point. Everybody just denies everything, and that's that, okay? If you had consequences, then attribution would be meaningful. But if you had consequences, then then the hackers' operational security would go up, because they would try to avoid these consequences. So you're sort of lost in a circle there. The other problem is that it's one thing to say, we've got attribution, we know it's, I'll pick on Peru, okay? We know it's Peru, right? It's another thing to say that, and here's how we know it, and here's how we prove it, okay? Because if the United States were to take action, I don't want to pick on Peru, but it's a nice short name I can use, right? If the United States were to take action against Peru without having stated the basis on which we carried out this action, it would be in many people's eyes indistinguishable from an act of aggression.
So
you have to make that case.
Is that, in your eyes, one of the benefits of sanctioning countries? And because you have to say what it is, beyond just the actual economic impacts. I mean, is the attribution and public case a part of that? I
don't see that we've actually explained our attribution before we went ahead and sanctioned individuals in North Korea. Not that I think we're wrong. Okay, I happen to think in this case we pretty much have it correct. But in the broader case, if we're going to use attribution and some sort of sanctions, retaliation, punishment, what have you, then we're going to have to be a little more open about how we know what we know.
Got it. So I do want to ask one question on a different topic. It came up a little bit with the conversation with Chris Painter, and that's this encryption debate here at home, and how law enforcement and intelligence agencies are saying that the stronger encryption in consumer devices is making it harder for them to carry out their investigations. But from a diplomatic perspective, the U.S. does promote a free internet and having access for people to speak securely and support strong encryption. So Eric, maybe you could give us a short example or two of other countries where people might rely on encryption and anonymizing services to speak securely or avoid crackdown by governments, and how some of this discussion here at home might be complicating the diplomatic frontier.
Sure. It's what occupies most of my time. There are definitely needs that actors have around the world who are operating in repressive environments and need to protect themselves or protect others that they're trying to help. There is also, over and above that, as I said before, legitimate security needs that ordinary consumers need to use to access these networks and perform financial and other transactions in relative confidence. The issue always comes up, and this always comes up when we look at these programs or our elected representatives ask us about these programs every year, is how do you make sure that the right tools are in the hands of the good guys and keep the tools out of the hands of the bad guys? even though the bad guys generally never think that they're bad guys in the first place. But having said that, if you are motivated to commit crime and evade the law, whether or not you use advanced crypto technology or an anonymizing tool is really incidental. If there are motivations, like in the case of the drug cartels, to actually build and deploy a submarine that can sail undetected into American territorial waters, then just because somebody uses an anonymizing tool is really incidental to this. The studies that we've done on this subject, including one by my colleague here on this very subject, indicates that that usage is probably about the same percentage as any other technology or method would be used by organized crime or an opportunistic
So let's say you're
actor.
So let's say you're a company and this does become part of the U.S. policy to have, ways for them to get encrypted, for U.S. law enforcement to get encrypted data. Do you think that other countries are, from the government perspective, do you think that other countries would actually ask for that as well? And how do you think that this would complicate the U.S. position?
There are many countries around the world that outlaw certain forms of encryption in the hands of private citizens. I think earlier you mentioned kind of Second Amendment rights in this. I suppose you could look at it as a Second Amendment right in cyberspace, if you will. But having said that, why do governments do this? Why do governments do this? Because they want to read the mail, and they're concerned about their domestic opposition. And it's sometimes a threat to the legitimacy and the stability of the regime. And to the extent that a government doesn't trust its own people, it's going to crack down on the ability of people to organize and communicate in relative safety.
And so, Martin, do you think that by having this discussion here between as law enforcement and intelligence officials ask for this kind of access here at home, how do you think that might complicate some of the diplomatic discussions?
I'm never one here to say we shouldn't have discussions because I believe in freedom of speech, but I also believe that 20 years ago there was a similar discussion about the Clipper chip, which is making me feel really old because the government lost that one really badly. And I don't see anything that's going to tell me they're going to do any better this time. There's just this, I'll say a quasi-statistic because I'm not 100% certain it's true, but I'm willing to bet on it, okay? With the exception of defense companies and telephone companies, every single large IT company has more customers overseas than they have in the United States, which means that the average customer of every large IT company in America is subject to being surveilled by U.S. intelligence sources. And that is, of course, going to affect the decisions made in corporate America.
And do you have anything you want to add on this topic? Or?
What I would say is a couple of things emphasizing some of the points up here. Number one, if there's a forced front door in a product and service environment in the United States, the same thing would occur in other environments, reciprocity in foreign affairs. This is just how things happen. The other thing is, as my colleagues here stated, basically, if you were to force that kind of change, the bad guys are just going to go to alternative technologies. And so all you're going to do is move a set of people to alternative technologies where it becomes increasingly difficult to kind of find them. Encryption is a good thing. Encryption needs to occur at scale, data in motion, data at rest, and we need to continue to work on conversations around the appropriate roles, both for privacy of our domestic citizens, as well as for the privacy of our international customers. And what, again, that whole thing that I said at the beginning, that conversation between states on acceptable behavior, not only in security, but also in intelligence actions, is very important.
Okay, great. Well, so we have time for some questions. We are running out of time a little bit, so maybe we'll take two at a time if we can we do that? Does anybody have any questions? Yes, right here, and we'll go straight next to, does anyone else have a question? And then back in the back after, right after.
Tom Goldberg with Lineage. I have the privilege of sharing a suite of offices with Ken Feinberg, who's just down the hall. He's just finishing up the GM liability issue. he was just joking the other day that maybe it's going to move to the internet as his next project. Given that DoD is now shifting liabilities to suppliers for losses that the department sustains, do you see that the marketplace is going to follow that in terms of moving from a license agreement for software and hardware in some cases to one where liability shifts to the makers of those products, such that companies or institutions that lose through whatever means, international or domestic, can find restitution?
Okay, great. Actually, that was a long one, so maybe someone want to take that over here?
I can make a few comments here. So software liability has been a discussion for a very long period of time, and I think it will continue to be a conversation for a very long period of time, particularly as we start to see other industries that you wouldn't necessarily have traditionally thought of as technology companies building software products and services. There's already a shift in the environment from enterprise and licensed architecture agreements into the kind of agreements that you're using in cloud services. And so I think there will continue to be a conversation here. What's important in that conversation is a key recognition that there will never be an environment in which you have no vulnerabilities. That is, if there is liability for any vulnerability, that is not going to make sense. What companies can do and should be doing, and what mine does and what we promote with others, is taking the kind of training, tooling, and practices to reduce the number and severity of vulnerabilities and have an effective response process to deal with the ones that are in the environment. And if you think that the conversation on liability may continue to evolve, it will probably be more focused on the kind of processes that are in place, both to reduce vulnerabilities and to respond to them, rather than an absolute line of any vulnerability equals liability.
Eric, do you have anything you want to add quickly?
Well, yeah, that's all good and proper. There's a next step in the process, and that is that there's a growing move to try and have a legal regime, laws that would compel disclosure of compromises to data, so that companies would be put in a position, if they collect personal information and there has been some exfiltration of it, that they would be obligated to inform their customers or inform the public. The idea behind that is it will then compel additional security measures to protect that information in the first place. On the other hand, what generally follows that train of thinking is indemnification. So on the one hand, yes, I'll go ahead and disclose it, but please don't sue me after I do it. And that's a rather complicated debate, and it takes it to another level.
And Jack in the back.
Hey, this one's a little more 30,000 foot question, but I mean, if I don't misunderstand the comments made by Barton, it seems like very crassly the position is before the Chinese agreement, we have private industry mostly left to fend for itself, and then afterward, we're sort of, I think we heard earlier in the day, waiting on whether or not we can rely for any other outcome.
Let me correct that.
Okay.
I said two things. That was partially one of them. But what I really said about the agreement was until the agreement, I couldn't see any significant decision that had been made in Washington, D.C. If this agreement works, that may have been the first example.
Right. And I think my question was, I just wanted to get the other two takes on that same deliberation.
So I would say both government and industry obviously have key roles here. There have been, I think, progress both here domestically and internationally, and governments working to both recognize the cybersecurity challenges and kind of both think about how to improve their own defenses and the defenses of, for example, what's going on in the marketplace with critical infrastructure. At the same time, there are a lot of capabilities in the private sector, and we have clear responsibilities in this space as well. And so I wouldn't say it's either or. I would say that I think there has potentially been more out of the private sector that has been able to effectuate change. But governments, I think, as someone said earlier, the Pentagon doesn't necessarily move fast. And that doesn't just relate to this government, it relates to governments around the world. And they really are, again, kind of struggling to understand this space. And that's why conversations like this are so important.
Yeah, clearly, I would agree that that dialogue is an important one, if only to find out where the boundaries are going to be in this space. But it also leads to questions about a very, very different conception of the way the internet, if you will, should be organized technically and governed. Whether there should be essentially a flat structure that we have now with one DNS registry and a multi-stakeholder model, as opposed to essentially the way telecommunications grew up in the early 20th century, where you had national systems that essentially were connected to one another to form a global network. Very, very different models. They accomplish very different things, and national interests are very different in each case.
And we have time for one more question. Does anyone have a last question for the panel? Yes, we here in the middle here.
Thank you. I'm Josh Marciano with International Technology and Trade Associates. My question is directed more towards Angela. I was hoping you could give industry perspective on the trade-offs of the U.S. using sanctions. On the one hand, sanctions can deter cyber-enabled economic espionage. On the other hand, it could lead to retaliations from a large country like China that could either due to tougher regulation or push other contracts.
Yeah, but in some ways you again, a little bit answered the question. I think sanctions are an important tool in the toolbox, but the application of sanctions, both with regards to the scale of consequence in which they are getting considered, the scope of potential actors that are in consideration and how those get implemented, and then to a point Martin raised earlier, the case that is behind that and the degree to which there are other countries who are in agreement with those actions really creates a space. So again, important in the toolbox, but the application of that tool needs to be considered incredibly carefully because of exactly what you raised. Again, this idea of reciprocity. If there are particular sanctions taken against one state, you could quickly see retributional sanctions taken against, for example, US ICT companies, and that just creates a tit for tat in the environment that does not do a lot to improve security. As you start limiting the access to different innovations in the global marketplace, that's kind of bad for security for everybody.
You know, the point is not to escalate the conflict, but to manage it, right? So
and you don't want it to do that.
And you don't want it to do that, okay?
Great. Well, that's a great note to end on. Thank you all for being on this panel. We're very glad to have you. And thanks to all of you who came out in the rain to see our cyber strategy discussion. Hope to catch you next week at our cyber research and development event with the DARPA director and many other exciting folks as well. So thanks so much for coming.